The Japanese maple was a defiant splash of crimson against the manicured greens of Lilac Pond Estates. Ronald Trawick stood on his back patio, a lukewarm mug of coffee in his hand, admiring how the morning sun filtered through its delicate leaves. It was, he thought with the quiet satisfaction of a retired architect, a perfectly placed object. The tree, along with the simple stone bench beneath it, formed a small sanctuary at the edge of his property, a place for contemplation he had designed with the same precision he once applied to blueprints. It was his corner of a world he had meticulously crafted for a peaceful retirement. That peace was shattered by the metallic click of a clipboard. He turned. There, standing on his lawn just inside the low, decorative fence that marked his property line, were two figures. The first was Janice Larch, president of the Lilac Pond Estates Homeowners Association. She wore a visor that seemed permanently attached to her head and a polo shirt embroidered with the HOA's lavender and green crest. The second was a nervous-looking man named Bob, another board member who served primarily as Janice's silent, nodding echo. Janice was holding the clipboard. Bob was holding a retractable tape measure. They were looking at his Japanese maple with the predatory focus of vultures spotting a weakness. "Good morning." "Ronald," Janice said. Her voice was a marvel of forced pleasantry, a thin veneer of politeness stretched taut over a core of unyielding certainty. She did not wait for a response. "We're just conducting a routine review of the community's visual harmony standards." Ronald took a slow sip of his coffee. He had learned in his 2 years here that engaging with Janice Larch required patience and a careful choice of words. "Janice, Bob, is there a problem?" "A potential one," she said, gesturing toward the maple with her pen. "Your new landscaping installation appears to be encroaching on a common area." Ronald set his mug down on the patio table, the ceramic making a soft clink against the glass. He felt a familiar, low-grade tension begin to build behind his temples. It was the same feeling he used to get when a contractor tried to tell him that structural steel was an optional expense. "I'm not sure I follow," he said, his tone deliberately neutral. "My property line extends to the fence. The tree is well within it." "Ah, but that's where it gets a bit complex," Janice chirped, tapping her clipboard. "The area you're referring to is designated as a Common Area View Corridor, according to the association's governing documents. Specifically, a 10-foot easement running along the rear of lots 12 through 18. Bob, on cue, unspooled the tape measure with a loud zip. He hooked the end to Ronald's fence and walked 10 feet into the lawn, stopping directly in front of the stone bench. The bright yellow tape sliced through Ronald's tranquil scene like a police line. "See," Janice said, as if this crude demonstration was irrefutable proof. "The tree, the bench, they're obstructions. They impede the visual flow of the common space." Ronald looked from the tape measure to Janice's triumphant smile. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent 40 years reading surveys and plat maps, that she was wrong. This wasn't a common area. It was his backyard. But he also knew that arguing with Janice Larch on his lawn, in full view of the neighbors now pretending not to watch from their windows, was a losing proposition. He had to play this on his own terms with documents, facts, and an unassailable respect for procedure. "Janice," he began, his voice calm and measured, "I'd be happy to discuss this further. If you could please provide me with the relevant section of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and the specific survey map you're referencing. I'll review them. Please send them to me in writing." He had expected pushback, a demand for immediate compliance. Instead, a flicker of something annoyance respect crossed her face. She snapped the clipboard shut. "Of course, Ronald. We believe in following procedure here at Lilac Pond. You can expect to receive the official documentation shortly." She turned to Bob. "We're done here." Bob quickly retracted the tape measure and scurried after her. As they walked away, Ronald overheard her say, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "He always has to make things difficult. Some people just can't adapt to a community-first mindset." Ronald picked up his coffee mug, his hand perfectly steady. He looked at his beautiful Japanese maple, a symbol of the peace he had sought. Now the first pin on a new and unwelcome battlefield. He knew this wasn't about visual harmony or a non-existent view corridor. This was about something else entirely, and he had a sinking feeling he knew exactly what it was. Ronald Trawick's life was built on a foundation of order and integrity. His home office was a testament to this principle. Books on architectural theory were arranged by publication date. Drafting pencils were sorted by graphite hardness. On the wall, protected by museum-quality glass, was the official survey of his property. Lot 14 of the Lilac Pond Estate subdivision, stamped and certified by the county recorder. He had commissioned it himself before closing on the house. An old professional habit. To an architect, a survey was not just a piece of paper, it was the fundamental truth of a piece of land. His retirement was meant to be the capstone of a career spent enforcing that truth. For 2 decades, he had served as the chief reviewing architect for the city's planning commission. His job was to ensure that every new building, from the tallest skyscraper to the humblest strip mall, adhered to the municipal code. He wasn't a designer. He was a guardian of the rules, the man who made sure things were built correctly, safely, and to last. He found a deep, quiet satisfaction in structural integrity, whether in a steel-reinforced concrete beam or in a well-written bylaw. That was how he had first crossed paths with Janice Larch. It was nearly 10 years ago. Janice, then a project manager for a second-rate development firm, had presented a proposal for a mixed-use retail complex. The design was flashy, all glass and cantilevered angles, but Ronald saw the flaws immediately. The plans called for substandard structural supports, insufficient fire suppression systems, and an HVAC design that was not only inefficient, but a potential health hazard. She had tried to charm the commission, speaking of vision and innovative cost management. Ronald, unimpressed, had systematically dismantled her presentation with a calm, dispassionate recitation of building code violations. He wasn't cruel, merely factual, but, in doing so, he had publicly humiliated her. Her project was rejected, forcing a costly and embarrassing redesign. Her firm lost the contract, and he had heard through the grapevine that her career in development had fizzled out shortly after. He hadn't thought of her again until he moved to Lilac Pond and saw her name on the ballot for HOA president. He had abstained from voting. Now, sitting in his office, he suspected that abstention was a luxury he could no longer afford. His history with Janice wasn't a forgotten footnote. It was the unspoken context for the tape measure on his lawn. This wasn't a dispute about property. It was a reckoning. He pulled a thick, 3-ring binder from his shelf, its spine labeled Lilac Pond Estates, Governing Documents. He had read the entire volume, all 247 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, bylaws, and rules and regulations before he made his offer on the house. To him, they were just another set of blueprints for how a community was meant to function. He respected well-written rules. He thought about calling his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a widow in her late 70s. Eleanor Chen had lived in Lilac Pond since it was built and served as the community's unofficial historian. She'd seen boards come and go and possessed a keen understanding of the neighborhood's subtle political currents. A cup of her famously strong tea and a dose of her wisdom would be fortifying. But first, he had to wait for Janice's opening move. He had demanded procedure, and he knew she would have to provide it. For now, all he could do was prepare. He adjusted the framed survey on his wall, ensuring it was perfectly level. The black lines on the crisp paper were clear and unambiguous. They showed his property, his whole property, extending right up to the fence line. There was no mention of a common area view corridor. It was, as far as the official county record was concerned, a fiction. He hoped that would be enough. But as he recalled the look in Janice's eyes, that brittle gleam of a long-nursed grudge, he knew this fight wouldn't be won with a single document. It would be a war of attrition, fought with paperwork, deadlines, and the slow, grinding machinery of HOA governance. And Janice Larch was the one at the controls. Later that afternoon, he took a walk and saw the Henderson family playing in their front yard. Mark and Sarah were a young couple, new to the neighborhood, with a baby girl named Lily, who was just starting to walk. They were still in the hopeful phase of homeownership, battling weeds and marveling at the quiet streets. They waved at him, and Ronald felt a protective pang. They were exactly the kind of people who were most vulnerable to the whims of an overzealous board, too new to know the rules, too busy to fight, and too intimidated to question authority. They represented the community he had chosen for his retirement, a community whose structural integrity was now under threat from within. He waved back, forcing a smile, and resolved that he wouldn't just be fighting for his tree. He would be fighting for them, too. The letter arrived 4 days later. It wasn't a simple email or a note tucked into his door. It came via certified mail, requiring his signature, a tactic designed to communicate undeniable, legally binding seriousness. The green and white sticker on the crisp envelope was the first shot fired in earnest. Ronald signed for it, thanked the mail carrier, and carried the letter to his kitchen counter. He opened it, not with a letter opener, but with the precise edge of a palette knife from his old model building toolkit. Inside was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, embossed with the Lilac Pond Estates logo. The tone was no longer passively suggestive. It was cold, formal, and threatening. Official Notice of Violation. Date October 12, 2023 to Ronald Trawick, owner of 14 Lilac Pond Drive. From Lilac Pond Estates, HOA Board of Directors. Reference violation of CC&Rs. Par 8.4.2. Maintenance of Common Area. Dear Mr. Trawick, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, of the Lilac Pond Estates community. On October 8, 2023, a routine inspection by the Architectural Control Committee ACC identified an unapproved installation within a designated common area easement. Specifically, a new tree and bench have been placed within the 10-foot common area view corridor that runs along the rear of your property. This corridor is association property, and its obstruction is a direct violation of CC&Rs Paragraph 8.4.2, which states all common areas, including but not limited to designated easements and view corridors, shall be kept free of any private property, landscaping, or structures not expressly approved in writing by the ACC. You are hereby required to cure this violation by removing the aforementioned tree and bench within 14 calendar days of the date of this notice. Failure to comply by October 26, 2023, will result in the scheduling of a formal hearing before the Board of Directors, where fines may be levied. A copy of the relevant HOA plat map is enclosed for your reference. Sincerely, Janice Larch, President, Lilac Pond Estates, HOA. Attached was a grainy photocopy of a map. It was a simple, Unofficial-looking diagram, likely drawn by the original developer. A dotted line had been crudely added along the back of his lot, with the words "View Corridor" written in shaky, hand-drawn letters. It was a complete fabrication, bearing no resemblance to the official, county-filed plat map hanging in his office. Ronald felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was worse than he thought. Janice wasn't just misinterpreting the rules. She was inventing them, using a forged document as evidence. The certified letter, the formal language, the specific deadline, it was all part of a carefully constructed trap of procedural intimidation. She was daring him to challenge the full, self-proclaimed authority of the board. He walked to his office and pulled the thick binder of governing documents from the shelf. He turned to Article 8, Common Areas and Property Rights. He found the section Janice had cited. Work Rate .4.2, Maintenance of Common Area Easements. He read the full clause, his finger tracing the words. It was a standard, boilerplate paragraph about the HOA's right to access utility easements for maintenance. The phrase "view corridors" was indeed present, but it was listed as an example of a potential type of common area, not as a declaration of one existing on his property. The clause's power was entirely dependent on what was defined as a common area on the official plat map. Janice's interpretation was a willful, malicious distortion. He took a yellow highlighter and marked the entire section, the fluorescent stripe, a declaration of his own focus. The inciting incident was no longer a polite chat on his lawn. It was this piece of paper, this formal, documented threat, delivered by the United States Postal Service, and citing a rule she had twisted to suit her purpose. He was now officially in violation. The clock was ticking. He picked up the phone and called Mrs. Chen. "Eleanor," he said when she answered, "I think I'm going to need that cup of tea." "Oh, dear," she replied, her voice filled with a knowing warmth. "I saw the certified mail truck. I'll put the kettle on. Be careful. Ronald, that woman doesn't fight fair." The hearing was held in the Lilac Pond Estates Community Clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and the faint, lingering smell of last month's potluck chili. Ronald sat at one end of a long folding table. At the other end, arranged like an inquisitorial panel, sat Janice Larch and the 3 other members of the Architectural Control Committee, including Bob, who refused to make eye contact. A digital clock on the wall displayed the time in harsh red numerals. Ronald had prepared meticulously. He wore a blazer and tie, a silent signal that he was taking this matter with the seriousness it deserved. On the table in front of him, he had arranged his evidence in a neat, logical progression, a copy of the violation notice. The full text of FARBR 8.4.2 he had printed and highlighted, and, as his centerpiece, a large, professionally printed copy of his official, county-stamped property survey. "Thank you for attending. Ronald," Janice began, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "The purpose of this hearing is to address the unresolved violation concerning the obstruction of the common area view corridor. The 14-day compliance period has expired. Can you confirm for the record that the tree and bench have not been removed?" "They have not," Ronald said calmly, "because no violation has occurred." He proceeded to lay out his case with the methodical clarity of an architect presenting a structural analysis. He explained the correct, contextual reading of FARBR 8.4.2, emphasizing that its applicability was contingent on the official definition of a common area. He then slid the large survey map across the table. "This," he said, his voice firm, "is the legally recognized survey of my property, Lot 14, as filed with the County Recorder's Office. As you can clearly see, my property extends to the fence line. There is no 10-foot easement. There is no View corridor. The area in question is, unequivocally, my private property. He expected a moment of consideration, perhaps a request to examine the document. Instead, Janice barely glanced at it. She pushed it back across the table with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. "Thank you for sharing your personal map, Ronald," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "However, the association is governed by its own documents, and the official HOA plat map clearly indicates the easement." She held up the same grainy, hand-altered photocopy she had sent him. "The board considers this document to be the authority in this matter." Ronald felt a surge of disbelief, quickly followed by a cold, clarifying anger. "That isn't an official document, Janice. It's a drawing. It has no legal standing. The county record is the only thing that matters." "That is your opinion," Janice countered smoothly. "The board's opinion differs. We have a responsibility to uphold the integrity of the community plan as understood by the association." The other committee members nodded in unison, their expressions blank. It was a kangaroo court. Logic was irrelevant. Evidence was inadmissible. He realized with a sinking heart that the purpose of this hearing wasn't to determine the truth. It was a procedural formality, a box to be checked on the path to punishing him. He had been naive to think his meticulous preparation would matter. "The committee has deliberated," Janice announced. "Though no deliberation had occurred, we find that the violation is valid. A fine of $100 is hereby levied. Furthermore, an additional fine of $25 per day will be assessed until the violation is cured. You will receive a formal notice of this decision in writing. This hearing is adjourned." She banged a small, ridiculous-looking gavel on the table. Bob and the others began gathering their papers, a sudden flurry of activity to avoid looking at him. Ronald sat frozen for a moment, the echo of the gavel ringing in his ears. He had presented an irrefutable fact, and they had dismissed it as an opinion. He had played by the rules, and they had changed the game. He slowly gathered his documents, his hands moving with deliberate control. The survey map felt heavy, its truth rendered powerless by their willful ignorance. As he slid it back into its protective tube, he knew his approach had to change. He could no longer be a passive defendant in their twisted process. He had to become an investigator. He had to uncover why. Why was a non-existent 10-foot strip of his backyard so important to Janice Larch? The answer wasn't in the CC&Rs. It was somewhere else, buried in the records of the association itself. And he was going to find it. The first step was to seek allies. That evening, Ronald sat in Mrs. Chen's cozy living room, the scent of jasmine tea and old books filling the air. He recounted the farcical hearing, the dismissal of his evidence, the predetermined verdict. Mrs. Chen listened patiently, her fingers steepled under her chin. "I warned you, Ronald," she said softly when he finished. "Janice doesn't care about what's true. She only cares about what's decided, and she makes sure she's the one doing the deciding." She poured him another cup of tea. "She's been like this ever since she took over, pushing through changes, creating new rules. Most people just pay the fines to make her go away. It's easier." "It's not easier in the long run," Ronald countered, the frustration still raw in his voice. "It's appeasement. It empowers her." "So, what will you do?" "I'm going to fight her with her own weapons procedure and paperwork, according to the state's property code and our own bylaws. Every homeowner has the right to inspect the association's records. I'm going to formally request the minutes from every board meeting for the past 2 years, along with all financial statements and contracts." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "That's a lot of paper. What are you hoping to find?" "A motive," Ronald said. "This isn't about a tree. It's not even about our past history. Not entirely. This is about that specific piece of land. She wants it for something. I need to find out what." The next day, he found his second ally in the most unexpected of places. He was checking his mail when a young man from a few doors down stopped to introduce himself. "Mr. Trawick, I'm David Miller. From number 22, he said, extending a hand. "I couldn't help but overhear some of the talk about your hearing. Sounded rough." David was in his late 20s, with a sharp, intelligent energy about him. Ronald vaguely recalled seeing him with a laptop at the community pool. "You could say that," Ronald admitted. "I'm a paralegal," David said, as if confessing a secret. "I work in real estate law. If there's one thing I know, it's that HOAs can be a nightmare of bad faith interpretations. If you need a second pair of eyes on any of this stuff, or help navigating the request process, just let me know. I find this kind of puzzle interesting." It was the offer of a lifeline. Ronald felt a swell of gratitude. David. Interesting is an understatement. I'd be very grateful for your help. Together, they drafted a formal records request that was a masterpiece of procedural precision. It cited the specific state statutes and HOA bylaws that guaranteed Ronald's right to access. And it listed, with exhaustive detail, every document they wanted: meeting minutes, financial ledgers, vendor contracts, ACC decisions, and all correspondence related to common area maintenance for the last 24 months. They sent it to the HOA's management company via certified mail, creating another undeniable paper trail. The response, which came 2 weeks later, was a large cardboard box filled with paper. It was a document dump, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. But to a man like Ronald, it was a treasure map. He and David spent the next several evenings at Ronald's dining table, which had been converted into a war room. They sorted, collated, and read, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. Most of it was mundane invoices for pool chemicals, approvals for new roof shingles, debates over holiday decoration rules. But then, Ronald found it. He was reviewing the board meeting minutes from June of the previous year. The page was a mess of thick black lines. "David, look at this," he said, his voice low. David came over and looked at the sheet. The minutes for the June 15th meeting were almost entirely redacted. Entire motions, vote counts, and discussion summaries were blacked out. Only the perfunctory opening and closing remarks remained. What could they possibly be hiding from June of last year? Ronald mused aloud, a knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. This is a violation in itself. The law allows for redacting sensitive personal information, not entire sections of official business. "Hold on," David said, his eyes lighting up. "The minutes are redacted, but maybe the financials aren't." He dove into a different stack of papers, the monthly expense reports. He flipped through them, his fingers flying, until he got to the report for July of last year, the month after the redacted meeting. He ran his finger down the list of expenditures. "There," he said, tapping a line item. "Look at this. Larch Landscaping and Design, payment 1 of 3, easement beautification project, $15,000. The name hit Ronald like a physical blow. Larch. "Let me guess," Ronald said, his voice grim. "There's no contract for this in the box." "None," David confirmed. "And I've never heard of Larch Landscaping and Design. Let's check the state's business registry." David pulled out his laptop. A few clicks later, the answer was on the screen. Larch Landscaping and Design was a registered LLC. The address was a P.O. box in a neighboring town. And the registered agent, the sole officer of the company, was listed as one Stuart Larch. Her nephew. Ronald breathed. Mrs. Chen told me about him. He's been in and out of trouble for years. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The redacted meeting was where Janice had pushed through the vote to approve a massive, overpriced landscaping project. The contractor was her own nephew. It was a classic kickback scheme, using HOA funds to enrich her family. And the easement beautification project. It required access to the so-called view corridor. Ronald's tree and bench weren't just visual obstructions. They were physical obstacles to her corrupt plan. She needed his land, and she was willing to destroy his peace and fabricate evidence to get it. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was greed, disguised as governance. And now, he had the proof. The investigator in Ronald was now fully awake. With David's help, he pieced together the rest of the story. The easement beautification project was a ridiculously expensive plan to install a massive, sound-dampening hedge, a living wall of overgrown privet along the back of the properties that bordered a moderately busy road. The total contract was for $45,000 paid to Stewart's company in 3 installments. It was an amount that, under the bylaws, required a full board vote, but not a vote of the entire membership. A loophole Janice had clearly exploited. The most damning piece of evidence came not from the box of papers, but from the county recorder's office. At David's suggestion, they went downtown to pull the official, original documents filed by the developer when Lilac Pond Estates was first created. There, in the dusty archives, they found the master plat map for the subdivision. It was exactly as Ronald's own survey had shown. The lots backed up to one another, with clear property lines and designated utility easements at the sides of the properties. There was no common area view corridor. It had never existed. The map Janice was using wasn't just unofficial, it was fraudulent. She added it, David said, a note of awe in his voice. She took the developer's marketing handout, drew a dotted line on it with a ruler, and passed it off as an official document. It's fraud, Ronald stated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth, and she used it to secure a $45,000 contract for her nephew. They now had a complete picture, a personal vendetta providing the emotional fuel, a kickback scheme providing the financial motive, and a campaign of procedural harassment providing the means. The fines against him were not just punitive. They were leverage, designed to force him to either comply or exhaust himself fighting. But as Ronald and David planned their next move, Janice escalated hers. She must have sensed that he was digging, that her authority was being quietly and methodically challenged. She couldn't attack him directly through the same violation again while he was in the process of appealing. So she chose a softer target. She went after the Hendersons. The first notice appeared on their door one morning. It was for improper storage of recreational equipment. The equipment in question was their daughter Lily's small plastic slide, which had been left in their side yard, barely visible from the street. The fine was $50. A week later, another notice arrived. Unapproved landscape ornamentation. Mark had placed a small, decorative frog statue next to his mailbox. Another $50. Then came the most vicious one, nuisance violation. Excessive noise. The source of the noise, according to the notice, was their baby's crying, which a neighbor had allegedly reported as disruptive to community serenity. The fine was $100. Sarah Henderson called Ronald in tears. "We don't know what to do. Mr. Trawick." She sobbed over the phone. "We're trying so hard to follow the rules, but it feels like we're being targeted. We can't afford these fines. Mark is already working overtime." Ronald's blood ran cold. This was Janice's retaliation. She was using the Hendersons, the most vulnerable members of the community, as proxies in her war against him. She was sending him a clear message. Drop this, or the people you care about will pay the price. The notices were frivolous, cruel, and perfectly within the maddeningly vague enforcement powers granted to the board by the CC&Rs. Proving they were retaliatory would be nearly impossible. He met with the Hendersons that evening on their porch. They looked exhausted and terrified. "She's doing this to get to me," Ronald told them, his voice heavy with guilt. "This is my fault." "It's not your fault," Mark Henderson said, his jaw tight with anger. "It's hers. But what can we do? We fight her. She'll just find something else. Our trash cans. The color of our welcome mat. She'll ruin us over 100 tiny cuts." This was the second major obstacle, far more insidious than the first. The battle was no longer just about his property and his principles. It was about the well-being of this young family. Janice had created a moral dilemma for him. He could continue his fight, assembling his evidence for a final confrontation. But, in the meantime, the Hendersons would suffer, or he could back down, remove his tree, pay his fines, and perhaps buy them some peace at the cost of his own integrity and justice. He looked at Lily's plastic slide, now tucked away in the garage. He looked at the worry etched on Sarah's face. He knew then that backing down was not an option. It would only prove to Janice that her tactics worked. The only way to protect the Hendersons, and everyone else in Lilac Pond, was to see this through to the end. "Don't pay the fines," Ronald said, his voice imbued with a new resolve. "Not yet. Just document everything. The annual homeowners meeting is in 3 weeks. I have a plan." The night of the annual homeowners meeting. The clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment. For most of the year, these meetings were sparsely attended, a boring necessity for passing the annual budget. But tonight, the room buzzed with a nervous energy. Word had spread about the flurry of violations, the aggressive enforcement, and the strange landscaping project set to begin in the spring. Nearly every homeowner was present. Janice Larch stood at a podium at the front of the room, radiating an aura of absolute control. Beside her, the other board members sat looking uncomfortable. Behind them, a large projector screen displayed the meeting agenda. A small digital clock in the corner of the screen showed the current time. Ronald sat in the third row, a simple leather folio resting on his lap. Inside were 3 documents: the certified county plat map, a copy of the redacted minutes next to the unredacted financial statement showing the payment to Stewart's company, and a summary of his legal argument regarding the misinterpretation of FAR 8.4.2. David Miller gave him a reassuring nod from across the room. Mrs. Chen gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze as she took her seat beside him. The Hendersons sat near the back, looking pale. The meeting droned on through the usual formalities: the approval of last year's minutes, the treasurer's report, committee updates. Janice handled it all with brisk, dismissive efficiency. Finally, she arrived at the last item on the agenda before the board election. "We now come to the open forum for homeowner comments," she announced. "As per the rules, each speaker will be limited to 5 minutes to ensure we conclude on schedule. The time will be displayed on the screen." The digital clock was reset. A large 500 appeared on the screen in bright red. "Our first and only registered speaker is Ronald Trawick," Janice said, her voice laced with a slight, mocking edge. She could not legally deny him his right to speak, but she could control the clock. Ronald walked to the podium, his heart hammering a steady, determined rhythm against his ribs. He placed his folio on the lectern and looked out at the faces of his neighbors, confused, frustrated, and angry. He was not a natural public speaker. His entire career had been spent in the quiet, rational world of lines and numbers. But tonight, he was not just an architect. He was an advocate. He nodded to David, who was standing by the projector with a laptop. "Please," Ronald said to the room, his voice clear and strong. "Direct your attention to the screen." The countdown began. 4:59, 4:58. "Good evening," he started. As the first slide appeared, it was a clean, easy-to-read image of Ferber 8.4.2 from the CCNRs. "My name is Ronald Trawick, and I live at 14 Lilac Pond Drive. I'm here tonight to talk about structural integrity, not of our homes, but of our community and the rules that govern us." 5 Giorgio 03:30. He calmly and methodically deconstructed the violation notice he had received. He read Burger 8.4.2 aloud, explaining how its meaning was entirely dependent on what was legally defined as a common area. He spoke not with anger, but with the dispassionate precision of an expert witness. He was teaching, not accusing. The room was silent, captivated. 03:30:02:00. The board has based its recent enforcement actions on a map they claim is official, he continued. As David switched the slide, a side-by-side comparison appeared on the screen. On the left was the grainy, hand-drawn map Janice had used. On the right was a high-resolution image of the certified county plat map he and David had retrieved. "This is the board's map," he said, pointing to the forgery, "and this is the truth." The gasp from the audience was audible. The discrepancy was undeniable. He had just proven, publicly, that the board was operating with a fraudulent document. Janice's face was a mask of fury. "Mr. Trawick, your time is—" "I believe I still have 2 minutes," Ronald said without looking at her, his eyes fixed on his neighbors. The clock showed 2:01. 02. Giorgio 00:30. The question we must all ask is, why? Why invent a common area where none exists? David switched to the final, damning slides. First, the heavily redacted minutes from the June 15th meeting. This is what the board wants us to see. Then, the unredacted financial statement appeared next to it, showing the $15,000 payment to Larch Landscaping and Design. A low murmur rippled through the room. It was then that Janice made her move. "Point of order." "Mr. Chairman," she snapped, addressing the vice president next to her. "Mr. Trawick is presenting confidential financial information without context. This is highly inappropriate." Before the vice president could respond, she turned her gaze toward the back of the room, her voice becoming dangerously sweet. "Before Mr. Trawick continues with his theories, I'd like to remind everyone that the board still has a full agenda tonight, including an executive session to review pending covenant violations. The Henderson property, for example, has several matters requiring immediate financial resolution." The threat was unmistakable. It hung in the air, cold and sharp. A public declaration of war on the Henderson family if he continued. Sarah Henderson flinched, as if struck. This was the moment of his own moral test. He could stop now. He had proven his own case. His fines would surely be dropped. He could save himself and abandon the Hendersons to Janice's wrath. The clock ticked down. 0:45, 0:44. Ronald looked at the Hendersons. He saw their fear. Then he looked at the other faces in the room. Faces of people who had been cowed and fined into silence. He took a deep breath. "Our community deserves to be protected from predatory practices," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. He looked directly at Janice, and from conflicts of interest. He turned back to the audience. "Larch Landscaping and Design," he announced. As David brought up the final image, the state business filing, "is a company owned and operated by Stuart Larch, Janice Larch's nephew. The timer on the screen hit 000. The room erupted. The chaos was immediate, but strangely orderly, as if a dam of suppressed frustration had finally burst. Before the stunned board could regain control, Mrs. Chen stood up, her voice surprisingly powerful. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the president. Janice Larch." A dozen voices seconded the motion. The HOA's property manager, a representative from the management company who had been sitting quietly in the corner, quickly stepped forward. He had seen enough corporate meltdowns to recognize an unsalvageable one. His job now was to limit liability. "Given the evidence presented," the manager said, speaking into the podium microphone, his voice a balm of professional calm, "I would advise the remaining board members to table the rest of the agenda and proceed with the homeowner's motion." To Janice, he added in a lower but audible voice, "Do not say another word." The vote was a landslide. Homeowner after homeowner rose to demand Janice's immediate removal. The board, seeing the tide turn so completely, had no choice but to comply. A motion was quickly passed to censure Janice and begin official removal proceedings as outlined in the bylaws. Another followed to immediately freeze the easement beautification project and suspend all outstanding fines levied by the ACC in the last 6 months. Pending a full review, the relief on the Hendersons' faces was luminous. A third motion, proposed by David Miller, called for an independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 2 years. It passed unanimously. The community, fractured for so long by suspicion and fear, had united. They were cleaning their own house. Janice stood frozen behind the podium, her face pale. The edifice of control she had so carefully constructed had crumbled to dust in precisely 5 minutes. She gathered her papers with trembling hands and walked out of the clubhouse without looking at anyone, the door swinging shut behind her in the sudden silence. The immediate aftermath was a blur of handshakes and grateful thanks. Ronald was no longer just the quiet architect. He was a reluctant hero. The Hendersons hugged him, their relief palpable. Mrs. Chen patted his arm, her eyes twinkling. "I told you that you were a good man, Ronald. You just needed to build something different for a change." In the weeks that followed, Lilac Pond Estates underwent a quiet revolution. Janice Larch resigned before the board could formally remove her. The forensic audit uncovered not only the kickback scheme, but a host of other financial irregularities and abuses of power. The management company, under pressure, terminated their contract with the HOA, and a new, more transparent firm was hired. An interim board was formed to oversee the transition, and Ronald, despite his initial reluctance, was elected to serve on it. His first proposal was a transparency bylaw, requiring all contracts over $500 and all meeting minutes unredacted to be posted on a community web portal accessible to every homeowner. It passed without a single dissenting vote. He had used his position not for revenge, but to reinforce the structure of the community, to ensure its foundation was sound. One crisp autumn evening, a few months later, Ronald was raking leaves near his Japanese maple, now thriving in its rightful place. A car he didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A man got out. It was Janice's husband, Gary, a quiet, unassuming man Ronald had barely ever spoken to. Gary walked hesitantly toward him. "Mr. Trawick," he began, his voice soft. I wanted to say something." Ronald stopped raking, bracing himself for a confrontation. "She's not well," Gary said, gesturing vaguely toward the life that was no longer his. They had sold their house and moved away. "She's never gotten over that city project. You know, the big one. 10 years ago, she poured everything into it. When it fell apart, she felt like such a failure. She told me being board president here was her chance to finally build something, to be respected. I think she got confused about what that meant. He wasn't making excuses, just offering a sad, quiet explanation. It wasn't just about greed or a grudge. It was about a deep, gnawing insecurity, a professional failure that had metastasized into a desperate, destructive need for control. Ronald felt a flicker of something he didn't expect to faint: weary pity. "Thank you for telling me, Gary," Ronald said, and he meant it. "I hope she gets the help she needs." Gary nodded, turned, and got back in his car. As he drove away, Ronald looked at his small stone bench and the crimson leaves of his maple tree. His battle had been about more than a 10-foot strip of land. It had been a fight for the simple, profound truth that rules should protect, not persecute, and that a community's strength is measured not by the height of its fences, but by the integrity of its foundations. His quiet corner of the world was safe again,